welcome to another live show. I have Leith stacked and ready to join us in just a moment. Just before I start, a quick reminder, of course, as always, that we don't provide financial advice. This is a general conversation only. If you'd like to make a comment in the chat, feel free. We obviously moderate that. And we also have Super Chat enabled. So if you'd like to make a contribution, you're always welcome to do that, or indeed get your question to the top of the list. But the topic today, of course, is going to be housing and the population Ponzi. And Leith has been very busy on that over recent times. And we'll just mention, by the way, there's might be some background noises off here. We've got some work being done. I've asked the work people to keep it down, but if there's the odd noise off, I apologise. Anyway, without further ado, let's bring Leith in. Hi, Leith.
G'day, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good. How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Not too bad. On a freezing cold Tuesday night in Melbourne, I'm sort of wishing I was in your neck of the woods now, about to go into summer.
Yeah, well, we actually have quite nice here at the moment. The sun's out, the birds are singing, late spring, everything's blooming and blossoming. You know, it's nice. It's very different. No humidity, which is great.
Oh, that's good.
Now, let's talk about your favourite subject. Because you've been banging about population and population growth for a long, long time, right? And finally, the budget papers came clean, and you know the Green Party have picked it up. Other people are. We have a massive issue, don't we?
Oh, totally. Look, I think anyone who's living in Australia knows that we've got a bit of an issue with this at the moment, and the way it's manifesting most visibly is obviously through the rental market. So you can't sort of go, read the news, in a given day, or speak to a relative or a family member or a friend or whatever, and not hear about the rental crisis. So we've got this, ridiculous situation whereby the rental market's never been tighter, and at least not in my lifetime. And obviously rents are rising at double-digit pace across the large capital cities. So it's all a bit of a disaster in the making, and it's been sort of turbocharged and brought about to a large extent by this massive population growth that Australia's experienced in the last year. And it's going to get a lot worse, judging by the budget papers and the immigration policy that's been run by the Albanese government. So do you want me to quickly give a quick rundown of the numbers?
Yeah, the one that stood out, I think, was one of your earlier posts. We're talking about the size of Perth, aren't we?
Yeah. Okay. So the federal budget came out last Tuesday, as we all know, and what it did was it actually, it's kind of weird. Instead of being up the front of the budget papers, it's buried right at the back of Appendix A of budget paper number 3 on page 120 or something. They have the population net overseas migration numbers, and that's sort of like the assumptions that are used for the budget. But it's all buried right in the back. But of course, what I do when the budget comes out, I go straight to that, and I ignore the rest, and then I look at the rest later. Because I'm, sort of worked out what the sort of dodgy wool they try and pull over our eyes. And this year's budget numbers, it was telegraphed beforehand, but there was actually a few nasties in there that weren't expected. So the federal budget, so the October budget that they did last year, just after Labor was obviously elected, the post-election budget predicted that Australia's net overseas migration would be 235,000 this financial year, as well as the next 4 years after that. So 235,000 a year. This budget, they upgraded this year's net overseas migration to 400,000. So yeah, a bit of a miss. And then 315,000 next year. But the real kicker is that the forward estimates, so going out another 4 years, they've actually increased the base rate of migration. So it was the intergenerational report, the January population statement that the Orwellian Centre for Population produces, as well as the October budget, all set 235,000 basically forever. They've now it's after these 2 years of extreme immigration, it's going to settle at 260,000, and that seems to be the new steady state level. Now that's just to put that into perspective. The 60 years after the Second World War, up to mid 2000s, before it really rocketed, we averaged 85,000 net overseas migration a year in Australia. John Howard came in, ramped up the intake. It then got ramped up further under Kevin Rudd, and then it stayed high under the last coalition government. And the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, we averaged 220,000. So we went from 85 to 220. Now this budget has two absolutely massive years, followed by 260. So the new forecast is now 40,000 higher than it was during the big Australia 15 years leading up to the pandemic, when basically everything got crush loaded. The population grew like a science experiment. And obviously we had, issues in housing, across the board, everything, hospitals, schools, we all lived it. So if you live in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, you know what I'm talking about because we lived it. And the forecast now is that it's going to get a hell of a lot worse, because the population forecast in the budget, which is driven by net overseas migration, says that Australia is going to grow by 2.18 million people in 5 years. Now that's the equivalent of 5 Canberras in 5 years. So it's about 440,000 a year, or 1 Perth in 5 years. Now, you don't have to be a, rocket scientist to know that that is an obscene amount of people that Australia will never, ever be able to build the housing and the infrastructure for, even at the very best of times and the best of conditions. But of course, at the moment, we don't have the best of times and the best of conditions. We've actually got the worst of times and the worst of conditions to build stuff, because obviously we've had the massive cost inflation across everything. So all imported goods are expensive, material shortages, all that sort of stuff. We've just witnessed, thousands of building companies, collapse over the past 18 months. We're experiencing the biggest collapses in decades. These are from small players all the way up to the giants like Porter Davis Homes, which we heard about recently. And, the cost of building stuff and the availability to build stuff has obviously collapsed. So we've got this situation where the population is going to grow like it never has before, unprecedented rates, at the same time as we're not going to build anywhere near the amount of homes that we built in the previous decade, because there just isn't the materials to do it, and the costs are too high. And the building firms, we've got less capacity because builders are going bust left, right and centre. And it's the same for infrastructure. So we're going to just become a more crowded, worsely provided place with a huge, increases in rents, and thousands and thousands of Australians being thrown into homelessness. That's the fact of the matter. There's a year 6 maths tells you that's what's going to happen, because if you grow the population at a much faster rate than you grow the housing supply, you're going to have increasing housing shortages. And we're already starting from a base of the worst rental market in history, if you look at the vacancy rate and also the growth in rents. So it's an absolute inequality disaster. And the Albanese government's answer to this is to basically build 30,000 social homes over 6 years. And even the maths that they're using for that's ridiculous. They're going to put $10 billion of taxpayers' money punted in the share market, hope that it gets a return, and then invest up to $500 million a year to build 6,000 social homes, which equates to about $85,000 a home. So it doesn't even add up. But even if they were to do that, you're looking at 30,000 homes on 2 million increase in population. So 30,000 homes for 5 Canberras worth of population. It just doesn't pass the laugh test. And what it means is that the social housing problem, let alone the broader housing problem, is going to get worse under this government, not better, and it's going to get worse a lot quicker because of the Albanese government's, big Australia immigration disaster. That's basically the top level cliff notes.
But Leith, these numbers are way higher than were expected. But am I cynical, or is this about saving the housing sectors and saving the banks and pumping the mortgage sector?
I think it's about saving all that stuff, to be honest. I think it goes beyond that. It's about, I've said previously on the shows, we've got the 3 big lobby groups that pull the government strings that demand this stuff. So you got the big business lobby, you got big business, big property, and then also the education/migration industry, which is really the universities, migration agents, and all the hangers-on in that. Certainly it's to save the property market, but it's also, it goes beyond that. It's also to save, to inflate headline GDP and prevent Australia from having a technical recession, even if we all go backwards. And it's not just us who's doing it. Canada's doing it, the UK is doing it, New Zealand's doing it. It's just that Canada and Australia are doing it a lot harder than most other places. It's basically just a recipe for falling living standards. So, it sort of looks like you're growing the pie, but everyone's slice of the pie is shrinking. That's basically it. And that's just looking at it in a narrow economic sense. If you look at it from a livability perspective, it's even worse. And, we all know how this is going to end because we lived it in the 15 years living up to the pandemic, especially if you're in Sydney and Melbourne. You know what happened. You know what happened to your living standards in that 15 years. And suddenly people are forced to live in apartments rather than houses. If you live in Sydney, you can't drive anywhere without having to drive on a toll road these days, which you didn't have to do that 20 years ago unless you cross the bridge. So it's just all these and obviously, the cost of water, for example, has gone up because now there's not enough natural water supply anymore. So now we've got to desalinate everything. Well, it's going to get a lot worse as Melbourne grows from 5 million to 9 million. This is what projected in Sydney, roughly the same. So, it's just a idiotic policy designed to sort of benefit small subsets of the economy. The property lobby, the business lobby, the owners of capital, so the owners of land and that sort of thing. They're all going to get richer, but obviously, the average Joe in Australia is going to obviously be made a lot worse off. So it's also an environmental disaster as well, because apart from the fact that more people means more chewing up of natural resources and emissions and that sort of stuff. If you look at a place like Sydney, for example, and Melbourne's similar, most of the migrants go and settle out in the west. So they're going to settle in a place that's one of the hottest places in Australia in summer, that is miles away from the coast, that's on the foot of the Blue Mountains, so it doesn't get the sea breeze or anything. And then they're going to go and rip up all the natural environment and build concrete. So you're going to just create these ginormous heat islands, and then obviously to move water to these places, you have to pump desalinated water like 50 kilometers uphill. It uses a lot of power, and uses to pump water uphill to the western suburbs, which is where people live. The houses are so crammed close together in these heat island areas that people are going to be running their air conditioners all the time in summer. It's just going to use an enormous amount of energy and be a pretty horrible place to live. And that's kind of the semi-dystopian future that we're facing. It's either that, or you live in a high-rise combustible apartment. One of the high-rise dog boxes. So that's the sort of future that we're bestowing on our children, unfortunately, with this policy.
Yeah, no, this is the point. This is a long-term disaster, isn't it? And
it is.
Whilst you might make the GDP number work by measuring that as the critical thing that you're measuring, what you're actually doing is creating mayhem and disaster into the future. So strategically, this doesn't make any sense. But economically, well, you could argue possibly if you measure it very narrowly, GDP. But it feels to me completely off-key, and yet I don't think that many people fully appreciate the implications of what's going on.
No, and also for a country like Australia, I know if you've heard me talk a few times, before, would have mentioned this, but for a country like Australia, it makes especially no sense because we are a mineral-rich country, and basically what you do is if you double the population, you're basically halving your resource base per person. So, Australia, whether you like it or not, the way we pay our way in the world is by selling off natural resources. So whether we, dig it up and sell it, or we farm it and we sell it, that's effectively what we do. And obviously, if you're going to, grow your population by such a extreme margin, you double it over, 50 years, for example, you're going to dilute that mineral wealth, which means per person we're going to become poorer, other things equal. And it's particularly stupid. And other countries that are, resource rich tend to not do this. Like, for a classic example, the one I always point to is Norway. Norway's population, and in fact, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, they've all grown by about 25% since 1960. We've grown by 160%. Now, obviously, I don't think we should have been the population we were in 1960 because we're only 10 million people then. It probably wasn't enough. But I think we've certainly gone over the efficient size. We went over it probably at the turn of the century. In Sydney had 3.6 million people, Melbourne 3.5. The nation had about just under 20. That was probably the right amount, but we just keep growing, and it's just in the end, it's it's sort of a highway to nowhere. And unfortunately, one of the things used to justify this is the government says one of the main conduits to this immigration program is obviously foreign students, right? So we bring a whole bunch of foreign students in. They often do questionable courses. They work while they're here. Most of them work and they pay their way by working, and then with the hope of staying on as permanent residents. That is marketed to us as Australia's fourth biggest export. Talking about education here, but it's completely bogus, because the way they measure education exports is they say, oh, you're a foreign national and you spend this much in Australia, therefore that's an export. But the truth of the matter is most students come here with almost nothing, especially if they're from South Asia, but the Chinese are a bit different. But most of them come here with basically nothing, or maybe one semester's worth of money. Then they work in the labour market in low-paid jobs to pay their rent, their living costs, and then their course fees. And they often send a lot of the money home, which is import. But all that money that is earned here is counted by the ABS as an export. It's completely fraudulent. And then because of that, and we have so many students here, over 500,000, the education lobby, the government, and all the other hangers-on say, "Oh, look, education's our fourth biggest export. It's our biggest export. We don't dig out of the ground. It's worth 40 billion. Rah rah rah." You hear all this stuff, and that's used to then bring in more students, and then run a bigger migration program because it's this so-called great export. When actually it's complete bogus, because just about all that money they bring in isn't actually an export. It's earned here, which means it's not an export. Using the ABS's definition, I'm an export because I earn money in Australia and I spend money in Australia. In fact, I'm actually more of an export than these guys, because about 10% of Macrobusiness's money, actually quite a large chunk of our revenue is actually earned overseas. So we actually do produce some exports. But a lot of the students, a large share of it isn't export income, but it's erroneously counted by the ABS as an export. And I've tried to do a freedom of information type request with the ABS several times. Some other people I know are doing the same, and they just do not answer. So I'm going to blow the absolute lid on this when I get the chance, and expose the frauds for what they are. Because I'm sick of them using this as an excuse to just bring in more and more students because it's so-called export, good for the economy, therefore, and also is basically what's driving a lot of our immigration program.
And interestingly, today, same discussion is going on here in the UK. So we had the education sector trying to argue that more students coming in, more education, created value for the UK economy, whereas some of the politicians are now questioning this big migration. They're talking about 700,000 people this year in the UK. And the rate of migration is accelerated dramatically relative to where it was, let's say, before COVID. And interestingly, you make the point, they're all doing it, right? Canada's doing it, New Zealand's doing it. There's a sense of desperation, I think, in terms of how people are thinking about all of this. And yet, nobody really wants to make the hard decisions. Surely we should be looking at alternative strategies that don't actually require so many people just being sucked in, and more students and all of those things. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, it doesn't. And I'd honestly, if I had my way, I'd boot out pretty much the entire federal government. I'd ship in a whole bunch of Norwegians. I'd say, all right, guys, redesign our system to be as close to yours as you can, given our constraints, given our the makeup, the constitution, and whatever. Because I guarantee you get a lot better, economic system than what we've got. For starters, we'd be raising tens of billions of dollars from our, resource companies, rather than letting the carteliers basically bend us over and force Australians to pay some of the highest energy prices in the world, on the East Coast at least. My partner in crime, David Llewellyn-Smith, did an analysis last week, and there was a day last week when East Coast Australia was paying the highest gas price in the world. Like higher than Asia, higher than China, higher than all the places we sell it to. We were paying the highest gas prices in the world. So, it's just absurd. Can you imagine Saudi Arabian driving up to the petrol bowser, filling up his car and paying more for petrol than we do when he sells the oil to us? That's basically what we're doing with our gas. It makes no sense. And we don't even tax it properly. So it's, it's absolutely farcical. And it's one of the things that feeding Australia's inflation. Australia could have had much lower inflation, and if we'd simply had for example, the Western Australian system on gas. And Western Australia's got the lowest gas prices in the world and some of the lowest electricity because they had the foresight. They're decoupled from our gas market because of their distance. And their government, the Carpenter government, I think in 2005, had the sense against all the lobbying to implement a domestic reservation regime, where basically 15% of WA's gas was reserved for domestic use, and prices are capped. So they don't pay. They pay about $6 a gigajoule. We're paying, last week it was up to about 30 for the same product. And we're very rich with gas on the East Coast. 70% of it goes to China. We don't have a shortage of gas. We've got plenty of gas, but unfortunately, we're run by a handful of cartel companies which control 90% of supply on the East Coast, and they're effectively just price discriminating. They're charging us extreme rates while they sell the rest offshore and gouging us. And our stupid politicians allow this to happen. So it's just unfortunately sounds pretty depressing, but that's kind of the situation. And the RBA minutes today basically called it out. Well, they didn't call out, but they said that energy costs are driving inflation as well as rising rents through extreme immigration. So talk about own goals.
Yes, the point here is that some of these issues have been bubbling along by the surface for quite some time, right? But it's all come together, and it's been exposed because of the inflationary burst that we've had. And now the policies that are out there and the policies being proposed are going to stoke inflation even more, which is going to put more upward pressure on the RBA. And the minutes, of course, said there's still an expectation of that. And the energy shock that we had here in the UK over the last 12 months or so is still ahead in Australia. And frankly, the budget support for energy is, drop in the bucket. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference. So economically, it's a real problem. But the other point there, those gas players, the profits being generated, same true for mining, it's all going offshore as well. So economically, how does this actually really help the economy? I can't see it, Leith.
It doesn't. So the federal budget certainly has gained some money from higher corporate tax receipts. I mean, not nearly enough, but for the economy as a whole, I mean, you can't just look at the federal budget. This is unfortunately what a lot of pundits do. Same with immigration. They look at, so there was two things that drove the federal budget surplus that arrived last week, a $5 billion surplus, supposedly. The first one was there was a massive rise in income tax receipts. So unemployment's still low. I don't think it's going to stay much low at that level for long, but it's still low. Obviously, we've sucked in population growth, went up by about 500,000 people. So there's been a lot more workers, and that's generated a lot of income tax receipts at the same time as welfare spending fell because it less people on job seeker, etc. So that generated about 3/4 of their surplus. The other quarter came from obviously these high commodity prices, which is the mining sector has generated absolutely extreme record profits across coal, gas, and iron ore, and effectively they're made out like bandits, and the federal government's gotten a small little sliver of that, and that's boosted the federal budget. But unfortunately, in the case of immigration, for example, and this is one of the problems Australia's got this system. We've got this system where the feds collect 80% of the revenue, and the state and local governments collect 20%. And that always creates this disconnect because the federal government gains from immigration, and they also gain from high energy prices in terms of budget. But the costs of high immigration, I'll go with that one first, is borne by obviously private citizens, because we're now paying all these private taxes because so basically the state governments haven't been able to build all the infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, etc., to cope with that population increase, because that's mostly their responsibility. So what they've done is they've borrowed huge amounts of money. They've sold anything that's not bolted down, and actually things that are bolted down. They've sold off everything. They've privatised as much as they can. And then they've also undertaken all these public-private partnerships to build all this infrastructure, which has then led to high user pays fees. And if you're a Sydney side, just drive down any road, any of the 20 toll roads you've got, you know what I'm talking about. And what it's done is it's increased everyone's costs of living in terms of all these user pay fees and all this sort of stuff. So that's one of the costs. And in terms of energy, obviously the flip side of the federal budget getting some more money is that we're all paying much higher energy costs. So it hasn't been costless. It's been very costly, in fact. So we're all seeing our electricity bills double and our gas bills double, and that's fed into inflation across the board because energy is a key component for a lot of things. And if energy costs go up, obviously the costs of all these other goods go up. So we have all these second round effects. So it's actually been incredibly costly. And I like to compare it to Western Australia, which has got the benefits from it. Not as much as they should. They should tax it better, but they've at least got the increased economic activity from the mining boom, but without as much of the negative downsides because they've done the right policy in terms of reserving their gas, and that's kept their electricity and gas prices down. Us on the East Coast have done everything wrong basically, and yeah, sure, it's helped the federal budget, but hasn't helped my budget, hasn't helped your budget. Everyone else's budget is getting absolutely reamed, and so we've got this. Martin mentioned we've got this big energy shock coming up, and that's true. We've also got a rental shock because we've all seen rents skyrocket, but a lot of those rents haven't actually been captured properly in the CPI yet because the way the CPI measures rents, it measures rents across the entire market. So that's existing rents and obviously newly, expired rents and newly signed rents. And it's the newly signed rents that have had this extreme price growth over the last sort of 2 years. And only part of that's filtered into the CPI because it takes time for rents to expire and then new ones to happen, people to change homes, and for rents in the overall market to go up. So even if asking rents, the new rents that are signed stopped rising from now and they were flat for 2 years, we'd still get CPI rents still rise for quite a long period of time because as those rents that roll off reset to the new level. So we've got these, this double whammy for inflation where, rents, which are 6% of the CPI basket, and energy, which is, I'd say, a lot more than that. And once you count all the second round impacts, are going to be this, constant upward pressure on inflation for, at least another year or so, depending on what happens. And I think rents, it's probably going to be multiple years because this big Australia immigration, as the budget projects, is going to happen for years at the same time as construction's going to be stillborn for several years. So it's a pretty depressing picture, actually.
Yeah. So Leith, rental pressure, higher interest rates, which is putting significant pressure on the main budget, state, federal budgets, amount of interest they're paying. Households are having to pay more because of the RBA lifting the cash rate. The mortgage rates have gone up. So that's going to put a lot more financial pressure on households and businesses too. At the time that we are bringing all of these extra people in, again, I can't square the circle. I can't work out how this is actually going to take us to a useful, comfortable place down the track. And of course, the other question in all of this is, what does this mean for home prices? And of course, you've, I think, pivoted and you're now suggesting home prices are likely to drive higher rather than not.
Yeah, so basically the way I see it at the moment is, and I flipped probably, 2 or 3 months ago, and I got to hand it to him, the Stephen Koukoulas, as much as I thought he was nuts, he probably had this one right, so good on him. Yeah, I thought he was crazy, the old kooky. A few months ago, I sort of, you kind of could see the writing on the wall, like the core logic index had reversed, the auction clearance rates had started bouncing. It seemed like, against all odds, and this is very unusual because Shane Oliver's done some research which shows that at least the last 3 or 4 downturns, house prices hadn't started picking up until rates were cut. Yet we've had this weird situation where we've actually had 3 rate rises, so early February, March, and then the latest one. But the housing market started picking up at the start of February, and which is completely counterintuitive. So it's risen in the face of 0.75% of rate rises, which, if you were to say that was going to happen 3 months ago, I would have said you're nuts. Well, no, actually not 3 months, maybe 4 months ago, I would have said you're nuts. But at the moment, the way I see it is we've got pretty much all factors now pushing house prices up, except for obviously interest rates. So, we've got obviously the extreme immigration, we've got the tightest rental market in history, we've got almost bugger all listings. So there's a real shortage of listings as well as a shortage of actual homes to rent. And I think this is creating it's pretty obvious it's creating FOMO, so fear of missing out. There's a bit of panic buying going on, whether it's people who are who don't want to be stuck in the rental market. They're basically sick of getting kicked around. They can't find a rental, so they're going, bugger it, I'm buying. I'm going to do everything I can to buy a house. And there's obviously limited stock on. And then we've also, anecdotally at least, if you believe July and a few of the other ones, some of the other players like Domain, etc., say that we're actually getting strong rebound in foreign buyer interest as well, especially in Sydney, which is kind of makes sense given that Sydney's prices are leading the rebound. So, it looks like all the Chinese buyers are back as well since they opened their borders. So now we're getting foreign demand, which is also helping at the margin to push up prices. So, the only thing that's sort of holding prices back now is borrowing capacity from the RBA raising rates. But I think pretty much everyone agrees that the RBA is close to the top, whether it's one or two more rises, but it's near the end. And the way I think is once the RBA starts cutting, which probably towards the end of the year or maybe early next year, you're going to have all the stars aligning. You're going to have all those things I just talked about, as well as borrowing capacity is going to start rising because the RBA is cutting. And then I can bet you bottom dollar that APRA is going to cut the mortgage buffer. So they already kind of flagged it a few months back that they're looking at it, but then they decided not to because they don't want to contradict the RBA. The RBA is still tightening. It makes no sense for APRA to lower its mortgage buffer because it's working at cross purposes. But I reckon once the RBA cuts, APRA is going to cut the mortgage buffer from. So at the moment, the way it's set up is if you're looking to be assessed for a mortgage, you've got to be able to pay 3% above the prevailing interest rate. So if your interest rate's 6%, you're currently being assessed at 9%. So that restricts your borrowing capacity. What I can see happening is the RBA is going to cut. So say it goes to 5% your mortgage rate, APRA might cut the mortgage buffer to 2% or 1.5% or 1%, and that's just going to effectively reduce that assessment rate from, instead of being 8%, it'll come down to 7 or 6, and that's going to expand the amount that people can borrow. And when you've got that expansion in borrowing capacity, at the same time, you've got all these other factors and people wanting to buy because they're, they don't want to be in the rental market because it sucks and rents are going up at double-digit pace. And the biggest population increase in history, I think it just points one way for house prices. So, unfortunately, it's another government-inspired housing Ponzi bubble. Or another rekindling of the housing Ponzi bubble by the federal government. So, here we go again. Yippee! No. Well, I mean, this one's different. This time is different. It's always a famous thing. But this is certainly a different set of circumstances because as Shane Oliver said, and he showed, and in his research, and it's totally counterintuitive for house prices to be rising in the face of another 0.75% rise in interest rates after 3.75% increase in 1 year in 12 months is extreme, and yet they've been rising for 3 months apparently. So there you go.
And this is when real income growth is still negative.
Yes, it's negative by about 3.5%. Yeah. So we're filming this on Tuesday. Obviously, Wednesday in Australia, we've got the wage price index. So the latest. That'll be the March quarter wage price index. So it'll be interesting to see if wage growth accelerates. I don't think it will, but it might go up a little bit, but be fairly weak. So it's running about 3.5% at the moment, which is a lot of the scaremongers are saying, it's the fastest wage growth they've had in 12 years, which is true, but 3.5% was normal pretty much throughout the whole 2000s. Like I remember when I started covering this years ago, it was like 3.5%, which is what you'd expect. There was nothing special about 3.5% wage growth. It's just because it bombed so much over the last decade that now 3.5% seems great when it's not, and especially it's not when inflation's at 7%. So workers are going backwards at the fastest rate on pretty much on record in terms of real wage growth. So it's a pretty crappy time, especially if you're there's basically 1/3 of the society that's doing fine, and that's the You know, I mean, I don't be sort of one of these guys who plays the generational war, but if you're an older Australian or a boomer or something, you're probably doing okay because you're very likely to own your own house outright. And even if you're on the age pension, at least the age pension is getting adjusted upwards by the inflation rate. So the age pension rises by 7%. You know, it rises in line with the age with the CPI. But if you're like me, I don't want to do a pity party, but you know, I'm one of the third of Australians who's got a mortgage and, you know, 2 teenage kids and stuff. And you're probably the most expensive time in your life. And, you know, the third of people with mortgages obviously been hit very hard by interest rates and same time, you know, negative income growth. And then you've got the third who are renting who are actually doing they're doing the hardest because they tend to be poorer to start off with. And they're suffering from double-digit rental increases. So you've got sort of 2/3 of the economy doing it hard. The rise in interest rates is really only affecting a third of the economy, so it's not very well targeted. Now, if you want to bring down inflation, you're doing it by attacking 1/3 of the economy, but 1/3 of households basically, and then you got 1/3 who are actually the wealthiest, have saved the most during the pandemic, and are pretty much unaffected by all this stuff. And that's the fully home owning older cohorts. And they're doing, you know, pretty well. So that's just unfortunately, it's the younger generation, especially, you know, the millennials or younger who are getting hit the hardest, I'd say, because they tend to be in the rental market, and obviously they're suffering from the low wage growth, etc. So it's a recipe for generational war.
Interesting, because Tara Brooker did some research a couple of weeks ago, and he showed that the real take-home income, into real terms, for the cohorts below about 45 were lower now than they were if you go back 15, 20 years.
Yeah,
Whereas
I saw that. Great chart.
Yeah. I thought that was a really powerful way of showing just how bad this is.
Yeah, so everyone's gone backwards in this last couple of years of this high inflation, but I think he used it's pretty much the under 30s, I think it was, which was been hit the hardest. And they're back to like 2005 levels or something. It was pretty stark. So they already had, you know, not much income growth before the pandemic, and then obviously with the, you know, high inflation we've got and the very low wage growth, they've gone backwards at a, you know, severe rate of knots. At the same time as they're the ones who are most likely to be renting as well. So they're getting hit by the rental market, and then a lot of them would have dreams of home ownership, and that's a nightmare as well. So it's a pretty nasty situation, especially for them, and that's why you know, this whole kind of big Australia push to make the rental market worse is so egregious.
And interesting, because Robert just floated this question. I should put it on the screen as well for those who can see it. Why should wages rise when productivity is in the toilet? And I guess there is this whole productivity question in the middle of this problem as well.
Yeah, that's true. But if you actually track labour productivity against wages haven't kept anywhere near up with what labour productivity is. So, yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously, you know, in the long run, productivity growth should drive wage growth. But the fact of the matter is wages have lagged productivity for decades by a long shot. So even though, you know, productivity growth has been pretty poor, wage growth has been even poorer. And at the same time, you should ask the same thing about profits as well. So, you know, the profit share of the economy's gone to a record high. So why are they enjoying super profits when productivity is poor? That's another question. I mean, if you're going to ask that about labour, you got to ask that about profits.
Yeah, productivity hasn't really grown for a long time, and this corporate profit thing, it's quite extreme here in the UK, but it's much more extreme relative to income tax. And the other point, in Australia, more than 50% of total tax take is now in personal income tax, which is a record high.
That's right. Actually, I'll just make another comment with that Robert's question also. There's a measure which the ABS uses in the national accounts. It's fantastic. It's called real unit labour cost. And what it does is actually measures the cost of labour for firms adjusted for productivity. And Australia's real unit labour cost has basically plummeted for the last 50 years. And it's actually running close to the lowest level on record, and it's running 6% below its level before the pandemic. So what that shows you is that, workers' share of productivity gains has fallen by 6% even since the start of the pandemic. And that's after falling for decades. So the whole argument, we shouldn't have wage growth unless we have productivity. It's like, well, really, like the cost of labour, once you adjust for productivity, has been falling and it's plummeted. And it's running near record lows. So the argument doesn't really hold.
Right. So run the clock forward for me, Leith. We're going to see house prices continuing to climb. We're going to see interest rates probably go up and then come down again. We see a very strong inward flow of migrants. What's life going to be like in 5 years, 10 years' time in Australia for the average Australian?
No, I think it's going to be bigger, higher wealth inequality, and income inequality. So you're going to have, a quarter of Australians are doing very well and probably unaffected, still live in nice houses, etc., and whatever. But the other two, well, especially the bottom end, is going to find it really hard because they're basically going to be the working poor. And I'd hate to see us become a bit like America, but I think that's sort of where we're going. And they're going to be living in more cramped conditions. So if you're renting, you're going to be in share houses more because you're not going to simply be able to afford to live on your own or say with your partner or whatever. You're going to have to couple up with other people to split your costs. So you're going to be living in more cramped conditions. You're more likely to be living in an apartment because there's not going to be many detached houses getting built now. It's all, all the governments want to do this infill stuff. So you're going to be, chances are you're going to be living in an apartment or, if you're lucky, a townhouse. And it's going to be, you're not going to be feel nearly as wealthy as you do even now. And that's the unfortunate reality of sort of where we're going. If you live in Melbourne, for example, you're going to see your population grow by 500,000 people in the next 5 years. Sydney, I think the projection was about 400,000. Brisbane, 350,000. That's out of the budget. So obviously that's a lot of people going to these cities, and it means that we're going to have obviously a lot more. Everything's going to be more crowded. So unfortunately, that's the kind of future we're looking at. I think I can't see anything coming. I can't see like a stroke of lightning come out of left field to suddenly change the situation. We kind of experienced this a little bit in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic. We kind of saw this like a slow-boiled frog. We're just going to see more of the same, like what you experienced in the Big Australia 2005 to 2020 period, just at a more extreme rate over the next 5 to 10 years, because we're basically doing exactly the same policies we did then, but even more intense, and with obviously higher energy prices on top. So I think it's going to be not much fun. I think the 2020s is going to be a pretty ordinary decade for us, unfortunately.
Right, and there's an argument, isn't it, that basically it's another stagnation decade.
Yep.
As you say, inequality will continue to get worse. The quality of accommodation will be deteriorating. The congestion rates will be going through the roof, particularly in those major metropolitan areas. We've already seen that in recent times because nobody's investing in the infrastructure to support the boom in population. And
in fact, the federal government's looking to actually cut it back now. So the budget was looking to actually cut infrastructure spending, because infrastructure waste.
Yeah, but we can spend 380, whatever the number is, on subs.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good investment.
And to what extent do you think this is uniform across the political spectrum? So, I mean, I know that the Greens have been quite active on social media and is talking about freezing rents and arguing that the housing thing is, doesn't make a lot of sense. But it seems to me that the majority of the political weight on either side of the mainstream are really both in supporting the same strategies.
Yeah, they're all useless basically. So you've got the Greens virtue signaling about their latest bugbears are rental freeze, but yet the Greens are the biggest hypocrites going around in a lot of areas. So they support Big Australia. Like I haven't seen them speak up about high immigration since the late 90s when they flipped. They used to have a policy of a stable population. They got rid of that, and their immigration spokesman Nick McKinn is one of the biggest open borders nuts around. He makes Andrew Lee look sensible. The Greens are hypocrites. And at the same time, they're also some of the biggest NIMBYs going around. So hilariously, Max Chandler Mather, who's their housing spokesman, has been banging on about rental freezes. I've actually got a photo I put up plenty of times in my articles showing Max standing in his electorate holding up a placard with his constituents with a "Save Our Suburbs, No More Townhouses" sign like that. I've got to put it heaps of times. So here you got a guy who is banging on about a lack of housing supply while his party supports open borders immigration, but doesn't want to allow any infill, and also they don't like any sprawl. And they don't want you to be able to use any sort of fossil fuels to heat your house either. So they're just complete nutbags. They suffer from extreme cognitive dissonance. They argue one thing here while arguing contradictory things over here. Like they just can't have it all ways, and that's what they want. They want to somehow have affordable housing with huge population growth and massive rise in demand, but you're not allowed to build for it, and you're not allowed to expand your urban footprint. It's just nuts. And then you have the coalition who's made a sort of 11th hour stand against this Big Australia. But unfortunately, it's been made by Peter Dutton, who's, we all know, we all probably think the same about Peter Dutton, who was actually the Home Affairs or, / Immigration Minister under the previous government, which allowed this thing to go, not as big in numbers, but in terms of rorts, the visa system we had under the coalition was a disgrace. They allowed visa rorts left, right and centre and scams and exploitation and whatever. That all happened under his watch. But now at the 11th hour, because he's seen as popular, because he's seen me on Sky and whatever, make the case, he's now suddenly had his Damascus moment where now he's saying, all this immigration is not planned. Now, if it wasn't Peter Dutton making it, or someone sensible who wasn't involved previously in the same system, I'd take him a bit more seriously. But what I'd like to see is the coalition ditch Peter Dutton, get rid of him. He's got too much baggage. He's an idiot. He's just unelectable basically, and get someone fresh in there. I don't know if it's Andrew Hastie or whatever. I don't know. Someone who's not in the inner circle of the previous Morrison government, because they're toxic. You need to wipe the slate clean, get someone fresh, get someone young, someone with hopefully a bit of charisma. And then you can start prosecuting the case against this Big Australia stuff. But if you're going to do it properly. Don't do it half-assed. Don't pretend to care. And then if you get voted back in, just go back to doing the same thing. Because I'm 99% sure that's what they'll do anyway. They'll just tinker around the edges, and we'll still end up with maybe slightly lower immigration, a bit like when Scott Morrison so-called cut the immigration intake marginally. But it's not. It's still going to be Big Australia. It's just Big Australia with a different flavour, and probably not quite as Big Australia. Under Albanese, it's huge, ginormous, gigantic Australia, and under coalition, it might be Big Australia, but with more dodgy scams on the side and more exploitation of temporary migrants. So look, I don't have a whole lot of faith about either of them, but look, I will give the coalition some credit. They've at least broken this gentleman's agreement, this tripartisan, unwritten agreement, or maybe it is written, I don't know, between Labor coalition and Greens not to question each other on this. And they've at least broken rank, at least in sentiment, and that's how it starts. So, but I don't hold a lot of faith, and I don't trust them, and because the guy who's saying it, the guy who's in charge of that party was the guy who ran the system, only 9 months ago. And that was a joke as well. So, that's unfortunately the political system we've got at the moment. We've got, clowns to the left and jokers to the right, and the nutbag greens in the middle. So,
otherwise it's all good.
Poison. Yeah, otherwise it's all good. Yeah, pick your poison.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I'm here in the UK at the moment is
Yeah.
I can see
Well,
some of
like,
this
when I
stuff
hear about the
bubbling
UK,
up
it's
and thinking, oh, maybe I should crystallise and move on. Now,
Yeah, see, Martin, oh, sorry, you're in the honeymoon phase, mate. You're in the bit where UKC, but then it won't be long. With 6 months or so, and you'll suddenly see how the sausage is made in the UK, and you'll be like,
oh no,
this place is just as
I'm
bad.
already totally aware of how sausages are made in the UK. They can't agree anything amongst even the people in power.
Yeah.
So the point though is, grass always greener, or is it just a different environment?
Just another set of idiots.
Correct. And in fact, the idiots are doing pretty much the same sort of stuff. So this is the really interesting observation, right? That the sort of thematics that we're talking about here for Australia are precisely being replayed in the UK as well. I mean, there's a debate at the moment about big immigration versus not.
And
Canada as well, New Zealand as well. Everybody's doing it. So there's a lack of clarity in terms of real innovation in terms of future policy. Nobody really wants to talk about what society is going to look like down the track. This is why I asked the question about, what's it going to look like? Because I think we should be asking those questions, because the decisions that people are taking, whether it's in the UK or Australia, at the political level and the economic level, are actually shunting people into a corner. And this is not actually going to be positive other than for the few percent who are actually sitting on top of all the wealth. And I agree with you. The risk is it becomes more and more like the US, and that polarization in the US really worries me, because you get political polarization as well. So this is not good.
No, it's not. And, I don't think any of us want to live in a place where, the homelessness situation I know in Melbourne is, if you go to the city, you see homeless people everywhere. And I never used to see that growing up. You see a couple, but now it's just, pretty widespread. And I remember I had my first real experience with homelessness when I lived in Canberra, and I went and visited Sydney, and we took the bus in, and the Murray's bus, whatever, and it dropped us off at the Central Station, I think it's called. And there was this like a whole bunch of homeless people. It was probably 10 in this cluster, and my wife and I were like, whoa, never seen that in Australia before. And now it's like that's called a Tuesday afternoon on this corner in Melbourne, that corner in Melbourne. It's all over the place. And that's been one of the changes that's happened in the last sort of 20 years. You wouldn't see that. You would see a few homeless. You always see a couple, but now it's like every corner now. When you go in the CBD, that's why I don't go in there. It's horrible. It smells like urine, and just don't like it. But it's quite eye-opening. And this has been a change that Australia's had in at least in the big cities. I imagine it's everywhere. In the last 20 years.
In Thirroul, which is a little regional village in a very small town, we actually had homeless on the streets in Thirroul. That was a really astonishing observation. I mean, small regional areas, people living in cars, people living on the street, it shouldn't be allowed, but it is.
No, and I've seen a few in my suburb, which I love. I live in Ashburton in Melbourne, which is like a nice area. It's like the crappiest suburb in the nicest local government area, if you know what I mean. So, but still a really nice suburb. And that's got, I've got parklands and all that stuff. And you going for a run one time at parklands, and I looked across to this car park near the tennis club, and there was like a bunch of cars, and people. I worked out, people sleeping in those cars. I'd never seen that in my suburb before. That was about 6 months ago during summer, and it's just like, man, it's like it's everywhere. And it makes you wonder, obviously, if you're going to be fire hosing 2.2 million people in here in the next 5 years, you're not going to build anywhere near the housing or social housing, let alone overall housing, to accommodate them. You're just going to get more of that. And it's just going to become more and more, you're going to have a lot more people in insecure housing. And it's just the fact. Especially, or you're going to have people who can still pay their rent but they have no money for anything else because their rents have gone up 10% a year. And they're, like the rents become you'll start getting more rental battlers. So you always hear about the mortgage battler who's struggle to make the mortgage payments. They spend everything they got, and they live on baked beans and tuna and rice and stuff to get by, and they don't do anything. Well, that's going to start happening with renters, because they're going to be, just to keep themselves out of homelessness, they're going to be forced to pay these super high rents. and spending just about any spare cash they got on that, and they're going to have nothing for anything else. So you're going to have people living in caravans, and we'll end up having trailer parks like they do in the US. And this is kind of the dystopian sort of future we've laid for ourselves without a proper social safety net, as well as just doing what we're doing. It's just crazy, and it's a big change from the Australia I grew up in, I tell you.
Well, it's a big change from what I saw actually. A few years ago when I was moving to Australia in 1995, and I thought, wow, this is a really good place. A lot of good social policies, but they've caught up, overtaken.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the thing. Like, it really was fantastic. Like I always look back in nostalgia, maybe because I'm 45, right? So my peak time of life when I had great hair and all that sort of stuff was sort of in the 1990s. So I'm a massive, like, I love that Seattle music, and Pearl Jam's my favorite band, Nirvana. I love all that stuff. I go to concerts all the time, cover band concerts and all that sort of stuff. Into that sort of stuff. So maybe I'm looking at it with rose-tinted glasses, but the 90s was really easy. So I finished school, got into uni, all that sort of stuff, did my uni course. And despite the fact that the unemployment rate was quite high when I left uni, finished in 1999, walked into a job easy. There was heaps of graduate programs at the pick of the bunch. Admittedly, I did a decent degree and all that, so did honours, and Melbourne Uni got decent marks, but it was just easy. And then at that time, like being at university, it was cheap to go out. You worked at Target, you could go out with $20. You had a great night out. The dollar pots everywhere. It was just, everything was cheap and easy. If you wanted to buy a house, which I wish I had, obviously, at the time, housing was dirt cheap. I had people who were students who were renting. Renting was cheap. Everything was cheap. Like, I had a car in LPG. It was 15 cents a litre. It was just like, everything was cheap. Like, life was really cheap. And then I look at the young people now, and you look at it and go, what do they do? If you're at uni now, you're paying much higher HECS than I ever did. You're paying much more for everything, whether it's rent or whatever. And, if you want to go out now, a pot of beer is like $6. It's nuts. So you can't go out and do anything now. No wonder they're all bloody vaping and doing drugs, because it's probably cheaper than doing anything legal. But it's just, total different circumstances to when I was growing up. And now there's, companies don't offer these graduate programs anymore like I did. Like I had the option of about 10 of them, and it was just easy. Whereas now companies they expect you to have your skills without teaching it to you. And they don't offer, so you don't get the training you used to get when you started off at work. And you don't have these opportunities that people my age 20 years ago got when they finished uni. And the fact that there's so many more people going to uni now. So in my honours year, in doing commerce in Melbourne Uni, I think it was 18 of us. I bumped into a young guy. I spoke to a young guy about 5 years ago, who did the same course as me at the same university. He did about 80 doing honours in the same course. And you go, well, there's 4 times as many people doing it, getting funneled into probably 1/5 the amount of graduate jobs because they don't offer them anymore. It's just your chances of success and having, a job where you can go into and get trained and learn everything is just so much slimmer these days. At the same time, your cost of everything's going up. And this guy who was, did the same course and everything would have probably paid 3 times as much HECS as I paid. So your chances of success now is just so much less than it was if you were 20 years, younger. And I used to complain because I got it harder than people who were, like my brother, for example, is, 4 years older than me, and he paid a quarter of the HECS I paid because they put it up. And I was like, oh, you're so lucky, whatever. But it's getting to the stage where every generation is becoming poorer and having less opportunity than the one before them. And it's a real problem. And I look at my kids, I got a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I'm just thinking, what's it going to be like for them? Are they ever going to be able to afford a detached house in a decent area unless I can somehow, afford to buy it for them? They're looking at a pretty bleak set of circumstances compared to what I got, and then mine were, arguably worse than what my parents got. They had it easier than me. So it's just like, is this what we really want? We really want to be bestowing onto our children a worse deck of cards than what we got. And that's unfortunately what's been happening. Like my circumstance would be a lot different if I was even 10 years younger than what I am now. I wouldn't be living in the house I'm living in because They couldn't have afforded it 10 years later. And, you know, my financial situation and everything would be a lot different to what it is now. And it's purely just because I'm 45 now, not 35 or 25. That's the only difference. I could have been the same guy doing the same course, the same brain, everything, the same parents, and I wouldn't have been as lucky as I am now. And that's kind of a crappy situation to have where, you know, where your luck in life depends on two things: how old you are, so when you got in or whatever, and also how rich your parents are. And that's kind of the situation Australia's become now, where it's like this generational wealth where you got to basically be born into a wealthy or wealthy-ish family to have, you know, really a decent chance of life. And that's kind of, you know, where we are. Like, there's always going to be the superstars who are the freaks who'll do well. But, you know, on average, that's kind of the situation we've got ourselves into now. And it's just not right.
Yeah, I agree. And I should explain to people that my audio is down a bit because I'm trying to keep the background noise down. So just hang with me. Okay, two fast questions. The first one that people were asking in the chat was, the RBA is saying inflation won't be coming down till 24, 25. You were saying interest rates could be cut late this year, early next year. Why would they cut interest rates if inflation is still above target?
I think they'll, I think they'll be a bit forward-looking, a little bit with inflation. So, I mean, if they know that for example, they got this baked-in rental increase, and they know they got this baked-in energy increase, and there's nothing they can do about it, and that's sort of independent of interest rates, but they think these other things are going to be coming down, they could just cut it anyway. And also, they've got to also have an eye on the economy as well. So, you know, if the economy starts weakening, and their forecasts are for it to weaken quite a lot, and that us to have a per capita recession this year. That's their explicit forecast. But, I mean, obviously, they'll be data-driven, but if the economy softens quicker than what their forecast, well, then they'll cut as well. So, that's my view. I mean, you know, when they do it, who the hell knows? Like, it's just this last 18 months has just been, last year has been a whirlwind ride for all of us. So, you know, I don't tend to have any great insight, but, you know, the financial markets, if you believe or not, they've penciled in the possibility of another rise, but probably more likely not, and rate cuts by the end of this year. You know, the banks are like divided. CBA seems to think we're probably peaked. So is Westpac. Who was the other one? NAB's tipping possibly 2 more rate rises. Can't remember what the ANZ said, but you know, it's a lucky dip. Like, just get a coin, do this one, and then that'll give you the answer as much as I can give you the answer, because I don't know. But yeah, I think
I reckon the Fed's doing the same.
Oh, mate, who knows? You know, it's really, I mean, you know, we certainly do have this baked-in inflation. So the rents, that's going to increase even if we didn't get any more appreciation asking rent. So that's going to rise for the next 12 months. That's like, you know, that's as obvious as they come. And obviously, you know, the energy stuff's baked in as well. But, you know, will the RBA look through that stuff? Like, knowing that, you know, if those things are still rising, but other things are weakening, well, then they can probably say, look, and obviously raising rates isn't going to do one jot of difference for those two things. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, they could probably twist the narrative to meet whatever they want to do, if they so choose. So, yeah, depends on what they want to do, I guess.
And who's in charge of the RBA in the months ahead.
That's right. That's right. And obviously, yeah, look, you sort of hope they'd be data driven. So, you know, not coming to any preconceived, you know, premeditated decision about what they want to do. They just see how the data comes out, see how the cards play out. And if it's stronger than what they think, well, they'll probably, you know, hike rates higher than what they think. But if it's weaker, well, then they'll, you know, cut earlier. So we'll have to wait and see.
The other question that people were asking about was the US debt ceiling, whether that's going to blow up or whether they will ultimately wrangle a solution. My perspective is they'll wrangle a solution, but it'll be down to the wire.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what happened last time, isn't it? They pretty much, you know, they played chicken, you know, try and extract some political mileage and blah, 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 and starve the beast and all that. But in the end, they'll probably give in, and they'll get a 11th hour solution, and they'll just be rinse and repeat. And then we'll be at this crossroad again, a couple of years, no doubt.
Well, I want to say thank you, Leith, for spending your evening with us. It's been great, and thanks for those hanging in and listening and bearing with us through some of the shenanigans with the noise in the background. If people want to know more about you and what you do, where's the best place for them to look?
Definitely go to macrobusiness.com.au. That's sort of my home base, where I write all my rants every day and whatever. There's a mix of there's a mix of property fluff, if you want just the quick property fluff, which everyone loves. But then I've got this more serious stuff as well. So I've been hitting obviously the whole immigration stuff pretty hard. It's one of my areas I've been writing about for 10 years, and it feels like I'm finally having my day in the sun. Where all the stuff I've warned about is now coming to fruition, and now I'm suddenly, people in the media seem to want me as well. Seem to be doing 2GB radio on Thursday mornings. I've got a sort of regular time slot up there now, and Sky News is now having me on 2 Fridays in a row, and it might be another one this Friday. And I'm doing several podcasts and all this sort of stuff. So it's like I'm sort of cashing in on the news flow right now, and the interest in this topic. But yeah, macrobusiness.com.au is the one if you want to find me. I'm not really on social media. I don't like social media. I've got a Twitter account, but I don't use it except just to follow other people. Haven't tweeted on there for probably 6-7 years. Got no interest. Same with Facebook, so don't even bother with that stuff. Just macrobusiness.com.au.
Yeah, and I recommend that site. Some very, very good debates and discussions and insights coming through on there. So one of my go-to platforms as well in terms of getting information, of which there is a lot of rubbish out there, but there's some also pure gold, and a lot of the gold accumulates in macro business. So it's good to see it there.
No, good thing. Well, thanks very much.
No, well, thank you very much, Leith. I really appreciate your time today, and for all of the points you make. And, it's a bit depressing, but it is what it is. And I think we should be calling this stuff out, because step one with trying to move to a different direction is to understand where we actually are. And the point is, unless we understand what's driving the decisions that are being taken and where we are, we're never going to be able to head in a better direction. And for my mind, this is a critical conversation. So we just keep preaching the gospel.
That's it. That's all you can do. Just keep hammering. One thing I have noticed is there's definitely a mood change among people. So this has always been, running this high immigration has always been very unpopular. But what I've noticed is there's a definite mood change. And I saw it on Q&A the other week. Not that I watched that garbage, but I did watch this one segment because I go and skim the questions, and I saw this homeless volunteer absolutely grill, the assistant treasurer, Andrew Lee, on live TV. It was fantastic to watch about the whole immigration thing. Totally did him like a dinner. It was great. Also, just the groundswell. I never would have thought I'd see the SMH publish, get inundated with letters to the editor, which is what happened 2 weeks ago, and to actually write a article saying we've been absolutely flooded with reader comments. Here's a summary, and summarised 30 letters. People totally vehemently opposed to this big Australia. So there's definitely, I think the rental crisis has really brought this to a fore, because everyone knows that it's wrong, what's happening, and most people know someone who's affected by it, even if you're not affected by it yourself. One of the families at my daughter's old school, she's just started high school this year, but one of her friends, they got booted out of their rental accommodation. They managed to finally get something else, but it was a real worry for them. Like their mother, 2 parents and 2 kids trying to get a house and panicking about it. And this is middle class people, in my area, etc. And we all know people like that, and it's just wrong, basically what's happening. And unfortunately, it's going to get a lot worse. So, it's time to make a stand.
Absolutely. Now we'll keep preaching the gospel and Keep up the good work, Leith, and thanks very much. We'll get you back on a few weeks' time, and we'll be able to see where things go then. So thanks very much. I'm going to take you off
Cheers,
now,
man. Anytime.
and I'm going to close the show. And just to let you know that next week Chris Bates will be on. We're going to be talking about Sydney property prices and what's going on there. So that's worth tuning in if you're live this time next week. Hopefully the renovations will be finished by then. And in the meantime, I'll be publishing more shows through the week, which I record and then release. So I look forward to those. Thanks for all the comments. Thanks for the super chats, and appreciate those as well. And I look forward to seeing you live next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, now signing off. Cheerio.